Sister-in-law, can you tell mother to let me drink a bowl of sugar syrup? I really don't have the strength to give birth anymore. On the bed, Madame Zhao was sweating profusely. Her face was pale, and her lips were colorless. Her sweaty hair stuck to her face as she looked pleadingly at the woman standing high and mighty beside her bed. Madame Zhao's stomach was bulging as she gave birth. However, she had already been trying to give birth for a day and a night, and her strength had long been exhausted. At this moment, she did not even have the strength to lift her hand. She knew clearly that if she did not eat something, she would not be able to give birth to this child. Sister-in-law, aren't you making things difficult for me? It's not like you don't know our mother's personality. If you can give birth to a boy for third brother, would mother refuse to give you sugar syrup if you wanted it? You should just work harder and give birth as soon as possible. Otherwise, it won't be good if this continues. Madame Li said to Madame Zhao in an awkward manner. If not for the fact that her second sister-in-law, Madame Zhou, had returned to her maiden home, the task of delivering Madame Zhao's child would not only fall on her, she could not give birth even after trying for a day and night. How unlucky. The child in her stomach must be a nuisance. It was torturing Madame Zhao to death before she was even born. It was August, the autumn harvest season, and the entire family had gone to the fields. Her mother-in-law, Madame Wang, was taking an afternoon nap in the main room. She had already said not to disturb her before the birth of the child. Madame Wang was not an easy person to get along with, so Madame Li did not want to see her mother-in-law. Madame Li's disdainful gaze made Madame Zhao feel despair. Madame Zhao swallowed her dry throat and begged, "Sister-in-law, can you pour me a bowl of water, please?" Madame Li rolled her eyes and said impatiently, "Fine, wait for a bit, I'll pour it for you when I go to the toilet." With that, Madame Li turned around and left. As she walked, she even fanned her nose with her hand and muttered, "It stinks." Madame Li opened the door and slammed it behind her, causing the temporarily bright house to instantly return to darkness. Madame Zhao lifted her hand and touched her stomach with difficulty, tears flowing out of her eyes. Madame Li did not return for half an hour. During this period, Madame Zhao suffered several bouts of contractions, but she did not have any strength left at all. As the movement in her stomach became weaker and weaker, her heart gradually grew cold. Just then, the door was pushed open. Madame Zhao's eyes lit up with hope again. She called out with a trembling voice, "Sister-in-law, mother, it's me, are you all right?" Su Sanmei's voice was soft as she walked to the bed and looked at Madame Zhao worriedly. When Madame Zhao heard her daughter's voice, she felt a little sad. She knew that Madame Li would not come over for at least an hour or two. If she wanted to give birth, she could only rely on herself. "Sanmei, get me a bowl of water. Don't be afraid, mother will be fine," Madame Zhao said weakly. She could not collapse. If she did, what would happen to her children? Su Sanmei's eyes were filled with worry and fear, but she still ran out obediently. She filled a bowl of cold water for Madame Zhao and carefully helped her to drink it. After drinking some water, Madame Zhao collected herself and said, "Sanmei, come, press on my stomach. When I ask you to exert force, push down." She did not have any strength left. It was impossible for her to give birth to the child on her own. Madame Li, who was supposed to help in delivering the child, was not coming back, and the child in her womb was moving less and less. She knew that she had to give birth immediately in order for the child to survive. Su Sanmei was only 6 years old. As she was skinny and weak, she did not have much strength. When she pressed her hand on Madame Zhao's stomach, her small hand immediately trembled and retracted. She whimpered, "Mother, I dare not." Madame Zhao's tears flowed as she took a deep breath and said firmly, "Samei, you can do it. Only you can save my life. Come on, push down with all your might." The contraction came, and Madame Zhao's body trembled with pain. However, she was afraid that Su Sanmei would not dare to push her, so she endured the pain and said in a trembling voice, "Sanmei, if you don't dare, I will die." "No, I don't want mother to die. I want mother to live." Su Sanmei closed her eyes and pushed on Madame Zhao's stomach. Madame Zhao also gathered her strength. The excruciating pain in her body made her roar. As her lower body became lighter, Madame Zhao instantly lost her strength. She panted with difficulty and said, "Sanmei, let's see if it's a girl or a boy." Su Sanmei was so frightened that she stood there for a long time without moving. The door was pushed open and Madame Li rushed in. "Third sister-in-law, I'm sorry, my stomach hurt a little just now. I thought you wouldn't be able to give birth for a while. I didn't expect you to give birth so soon. Let me see what it is." As Madame Li spoke, she walked to the bed and lifted the blanket. Madame Zhao had her heart in the mouth. Right now, she could not be bothered to blame Madame Li at all. She only wanted to know the gender of the child. Madame Li turned to look at her with a smile in her eyes. "Third sister-in-law, congratulations. You've got another daughter." Madame Zhao's expectant gaze instantly dimmed as tears welled up in her eyes. Meanwhile, Madame Li happily picked up the child. She casually cleaned the infant up and cut the umbilical cord. She wrapped her in some old clothes and slapped the baby girl's butt. The baby girl started crying. Madame Li put the child down beside Madame Zhao and said with a smile, "Third sister-in-law, have a good rest. I'll go ahead and report the good news to mother." With that, Madame Li turned around and left without looking back at Madame Zhao. Soon, only Madame Zhao and Su Sanmei were left in the room. Su Sanmei had been standing by the bed. She looked at Madame Zhao with fear in her eyes. She cried, "Mother." Madame Zhao did not respond. Su Sanmei said weakly, "Mother, I'm scared." Only then did Madame Zhao's hollow eyes regain their luster. Tears fell silently. "Oh, Sanmei," Madame Zhao choked with despair. "Since she gave birth to a daughter, her whole family will struggle to make ends meet. Among her 4 children, the eldest was mentally disabled, and the second eldest son also became retarded after a fever. The 2 daughters were healthy, but daughters were useless in the eyes of her mother-in-law. Mother, don't cry. Sanmei will take good care of her sister." Su Sanmei knelt in front of the bed and hugged Madame Zhao's hand. Madame Zhao turned to look at her newborn daughter. Her youngest daughter had calmed down after crying for a while. She was not asleep. Instead, she seemed to be looking at her with her eyes open. Madame Zhao's nose stung and tears flowed silently. Her mother-in-law would definitely not like her having a daughter and would not give her anything good to eat. She might not even be able to produce any milk. Her daughter would probably not be able to survive. 10 months of pregnancy made her heart ache. She must have been a heinous sinner in her previous life, so the heavens were punishing her like this in this life. She gave birth to another loser. What a useless thing. If I were her, I'd be so ashamed I'd bang my head against the wall and die. Why did the Su family marry such a jinx who only gives us useless things? Madame Wang's curses came from the main room. It was as unpleasant as it could be. As Madame Zhao listened to the curses, her tears flowed even more fiercely. Su Xiaolu looked at the teary Madame Zhao and cursed in her heart. She was a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine who lived in the 21st century. On her way to a late-night snack, she'd been killed by a car that had raced up the sidewalk. Unexpectedly, when she regained consciousness, she had become a baby. She was reborn through the womb, and into the olden days at that. The current situation was very bad. In the olden days of favoring boys over girls, her birth had not been a good thing. He knew from the old woman's curses that there were people who wished her dead as soon as she was born. Su Xiaolu vaguely felt that something was wrong with Madame Zhao. Her strong intuition told her that Madame Zhao was in danger. Thinking of her birth, Su Xiaolu quickly thought of postpartum hemorrhage. However, she was a baby now and could not speak. The others in the family could not be counted on either. Su Xiaolu's gaze landed on the little girl beside Madame Zhao. Just now, she heard this little girl call Madame Zhao, and Madame Zhao called her Sanmei. This must be her elder sister. Who could save Madame Zhao? She was probably the only one who could, but she couldn't speak. How could she let her sister know that her mother was in danger? Su Xiaolu couldn't think of a way, so she held her breath and cried, "Wah wah." Su Xiaolu cried her heart out. Madame Zhao's thoughts were called back. Her mother's instincts made her raise her hand to pat her daughter. "Simei, be good, don't cry, don't cry." Su Sanmei also came back to her senses and climbed onto bed to help Madame Zhao coax her sister. "Be good, sis, don't cry, I'll carry you." Su Sanmei knelt on the inner side of the bed and carefully carried Su Xiaolu to coax her. Su Xiaolu cried non-stop. Her face was red from holding her breath. Although she was getting breathless, she did not stop. Her cries were so loud that they drowned out Madame Wang's curses. Fortunately, she was healthy and loud. Wah! Her cries made Madame Zhao's heart clench. She was afraid that her daughter might have some illness. She knew that she could not count on her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, so she gently tugged at Su Sanmei's sleeve and said weakly, "Sanmei, put Simei down beside mother. Go to the field and call your father back." Su Sanmei obediently put down Su Xiaolu and got off the bed. Then, she quickly opened the door and ran out. Seeing that Su Sanmei had gone to get help, Su Xiaolu stopped crying. In the main room, Madame Wang was cursing non-stop. "You jinx, cry until you die. If you cry again, I'll come over and suffocate you, you rotten loser. Cry yourself to death. Shut up and die, you short-lived bastard." Madame Wang's scolding was unpleasant, and Madame Zhao's heart ached when she heard it. As she sobbed, she patted Su Xiaolu and said softly, "My Simei is a good girl. She has to be healthy and live a long life." Su Xiaolu stopped crying and was trembling. She felt terrible. She could feel Madame Zhao's gentleness and love. Whether this family welcomed her or not, her mother would definitely welcome her. but in the current situation, it was hard to say if she could even be alive to grow up. Turning into a baby made her powerless. Madame Zhao's situation was too dangerous. She could even feel her life slowly slipping away. She was frantic. Suddenly, everything went black. She suddenly found herself in an unfamiliar place. She was lying by a small spring with 2 patches of black earth beside her. She was still a baby, but something was different. She thought of the novel she had once read. Could this be the space? As she chanted in her heart, her vision darkened again. When she opened her eyes again, Madame Zhao was beside her. Her eyes were closed, and her hand was still subconsciously patting her gently. Su Xiaolu chanted to enter the space again. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying by the spring. She took a deep breath. The air was filled with spiritual energy. This place was a treasure. Since the air was full of spiritual energy, the land and spring water were definitely the same. If only she could let Madame Zhao drink some of this spiritual spring water. Su Xiaolu silently chanted and secretly tried. Finally, she tried to secrete the spiritual spring water. She felt a wetness on her fingers. She struggled. Madame Li did not tie her up, so she was able to quickly raise her hand. She sucked on her thumb and tasted the sweet spring water. Looking at Madame Zhao, whose eyes were tightly shut, Su Xiaolu reached for her mouth with difficulty. Perhaps because she was too weak now, the spiritual spring water was only dripping out drop by drop. After moistening Madame Zhao's mouth, Madame Zhao licked her lips. She was so tired that she couldn't open her eyes. In her daze, she felt that her lips were cold. She subconsciously licked them. It was water. She wanted water so badly. The water was so sweet and warm. When she drank it, she felt a warm force nurturing her, gradually giving her strength. She opened her eyes and found her little daughter's hand by her mouth. Madame Zhao was shocked and quickly pushed Su Xiaolu's hand away. After checking that her daughter's hand was safe and sound, Madame Zhao apologized guiltily. "Sime, I'm sorry. I was so hungry that I almost ate your hand." After feeding Madame Zhao about a small bowl of spiritual spring water, Su Xiaolu felt very tired and sleepy. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. She hoped that the spiritual spring water would be useful and allow Madame Zhao to last until Su Sanmei found her father. She wanted to see it with her own eyes, but she could not resist it and fell asleep. Madame Zhao looked at the sleeping Su Xiaolu with a gentle but guilty gaze. It was all her fault for being useless. Her youngest daughter had yet to drink a mouthful of her milk since she was born. She had regained some strength now, but she still couldn't get up. After giving birth, no one came to help clean her up. She looked up at the dim roof and sighed. In the main room, the cursing never stopped. Madame Zhao gave birth to a daughter, which made her mother-in-law, Mrs. Wang, very unhappy. She cursed Madame Zhao's family inside and out, including the 4 children. Madame Zhao could not curse her mother-in-law back and could only cry silently. Su Sanmei ran into the field. The 3 brothers, Su Dalong, Su Erlang and Su Sanlang, were collecting the golden jade sticks in the field. Old Master Su led the way with his sons. In addition, Su Sanlang's 2 silly sons were also helping with the work. When Su Sanmei reached the ground, she shouted, "Father, father, go back and take a look. Mother and my little sister are not feeling well." Su Sanlang came out of the field with a big basket on his back. His tanned face was covered in sweat. At this moment, he looked worried. "What happened to your mother?" Su Sanlang did not notice that Su Sanmei had said that Madame Zhao had given birth to a daughter. Instead, he was paying attention to Madame Zhao's condition. Old Master Su also came out. He said with a dark expression, "What's there to see? She gave birth to another money-losing girl. Sanlang is not allowed to go. Do your job well." Hearing that she had given birth to a girl, Old Master Su cursed the black luck in his heart. His 3rd eldest son already had 4 children, but it was equivalent to having none. Old Master Su knew very well that the 3rd brother's family was going to be useless. Old Master Su's face darkened as he glared at Su Sanmei, scaring her. Su Sanlang swallowed and hid the bitterness in his heart. He asked Su Sanmei gently, "Sanmei, how is your mother? How about your little sister?" Su Sanmei thought of the weak Madame Zhao. She looked up and shook her head with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "My little sister had been crying. Mother doesn't have any strength, and she hasn't eaten anything." Su Sanlang's heart ached as he heard that. He gritted his teeth and turned to face Old Master Su's dark expression. "Father, I'll go back first. Chong and Hua will stay behind to replace me." Old Master Su's face darkened. Madame Zhao has already given birth to so many children. What's there to see? No matter how you look at the girl, she won't be a boy. Su Sanlang pretended not to hear. Somehow, he also felt vaguely uneasy, so he quickly filled the gold and jade stick, then tied a shoulder pole and picked it up. Before he rushed home with Su Sanmei, before he returned home, he heard his mother, Madame Wang, scolding him from afar. Many neighbors were sitting outside the house listening. When they saw Su Sanlang, they greeted him with a smile. "Congratulations, Sanlang, you're a father again. There's nothing wrong with having a daughter. They are considerate." Su Sanlang did not have the time to joke around. He only felt bitterness in his heart. How could he not tell that these people were mocking him? 4 children, 2 of them mentally disabled and the other 2 are girls. He would have no one to take after him. After picking up the 2 baskets of golden jade sticks and putting them down in the central room, Su Sanlang eagerly went to the back room. As he pushed open the door, Su Sanlang could smell the thick scent of blood. This smell of blood was even heavier than the previous 3 times. Madame Zhao lay motionless on the bed. Su Sanlang's eyes instantly turned red. He stood rooted to the ground, unable to take another step. "My dear wife." Su Sanmei had already run to the bed. She shook Madame Zhao and shouted, "Mother, mother." Madame Zhao woke up and said weakly, "Sanmei, you're back. Where's your father?" When Su Sanlang heard Madame Zhao's voice, he felt extremely excited. He quickly wiped his face and walked over with a smile. "I'm here, you've worked hard." After adapting to the dimness of the house, Su Sanlang saw his little daughter sleeping obediently. His heart softened. He turned to Su Sanmei and said, "Sanmei, go to the kitchen and boil some hot water. Let's clean up your mother." Sanlang, Madame Zhao teared. She did not want Su Sanlang to be stained with blood, but she could not move. She wanted to say no to Su Sanlang and let her slowly clean up by herself. However, Su Sanlang held Madame Zhao's hand and said gently, "I'm useless and made you suffer. Let me do this small favor for you. I can't do anything else." Su Sanlang was filled with self-reproach. He didn't have a single healthy son. He couldn't stand up at home. Madame Zhao had just given birth, and he couldn't even give her a mouthful of hot rice. Cleaning her up was the only thing he could do. Madame Zhao swallowed her sobs. Su Sanmei soon brought over some hot water. Su Sanlang lifted the blanket and cleaned up Madame Zhao's bed, but gradually, he felt that something was wrong. He said with a trembling voice, "My wife, why can't I stop the bleeding?" He knew that giving birth resulted in blood loss, but she couldn't keep bleeding like this. Madame Zhao's body was already frail and weak to begin with. If she kept bleeding, how could she withstand it? "No, we have to get a doctor for this. I'll go and beg mother." Su Sanlang immediately put down his handkerchief and got up to leave. In the main room, Madame Wang was still cursing. She even took off one of her shoes and hit the edge of the bed after each of her curses. When Su Sanlang arrived outside the house, he pushed open the door and entered. He knelt down before Madame Wang, who was sitting on the bed, and shouted anxiously, "Mother, mother, my wife is still bleeding. Please get a doctor to take a look at her." When Madame Wang heard this, she was so angry that she almost jumped up. She pointed at Su Sanlang and scolded fiercely, "What doctor? Is someone like her, who can only give birth to useless things, worthy of hiring a doctor? Why aren't you working in the fields? Do you want to freeload? Look at the bunch of useless trash in your family. Do you want me to raise all of you for nothing?" Madame Wang's tone was vicious and filled with disgust. She didn't like her 3rd son, nor did she like her 2 stupid grandsons, and she despised her 2 worthless granddaughters even more. "Get a doctor." "What doctor? Don't even think about it. If she dies, she dies." Madame Wang's cold words were like knives stabbing into Su Sanlang's heart, making him unable to breathe. Thinking of Madame Zhao, Su Sanlang gritted his teeth and said, "Mother, Madame Zhao is my wife and the mother of my children. Nothing can happen to her no matter what. If you don't get a doctor for her, if she dies, my children won't be able to live either. Then I wouldn't want to live anymore. If I can't live, I might go crazy. When the time comes, don't blame me if I do something insane." Su Sanlang clenched his fists. He was always obedient, but when he got angry, he was also ruthless. Madame Wang looked at Su Sanlang and was stunned by him. She seemed to have recalled something bad. Then, she took out a string of copper coins and threw them at Su Sanlang. She wailed loudly, "You unfilial son, eldest daughter-in-law, go to the fields and call your father-in-law back. This unfilial son is going to rebel. He's going to kill his own mother." Su Sanlang did not care about Madame Wang's cries at all. He did not feel any pain when the copper coins hit him. He quickly picked them up and ran out. When Madame Li heard the commotion and came out to check, she saw Su Sanlang leaving the house quickly. She could sense the unusual tension, and she immediately concealed the smile in her eyes. Then, she pretended to panic and ran into the main room. She exclaimed, "Mother, what's going on? What did 3rd brother do?" Madame Wang gritted her teeth and said, "Quickly go to the fields and get the entire family to come back. I want to split the 3rd branch one." Madame Li pretended to be shocked and terrified. All right. Madame Li turned around and walked out of the main room. When she saw the timid Su Sanmei not far away, she glared at her fiercely before quickly leaving. She had 3 sons. Madame Wang and old Master Su were already old, so this family would have to be split up sooner or later. The second branch had 2 sons and a daughter, so they would definitely want to compete with her. The third branch was much simpler to handle. It was undoubtedly a good thing to be able to kick this useless family out as soon as possible. When Madame Zhao went into labor yesterday morning, she was really afraid that she would give birth to a son. Fortunately, she did not. Now that Su Sanlang had disobeyed Madame Wang for Madame Zhao, this was really a good opportunity. Madame Li was overjoyed, but she showed a fearful look on her face. Along the way, she even messed up her hair and cried. She ran into the fields and cried loudly from a distance. Father, Dalong, second brother, come back and take a look. Third brother hit mother. Su Sanlang took the money and ran to the old doctor's house in the village. He said anxiously, Dr. Wu, quickly go to my house and save my children's mother. After she gave birth to Simei, she has been bleeding non-stop. Dr. Wu was an old man in his 60s. He had come to the village 3 years ago and knew medical skills. He settled down in the village and anyone who had a headache or fever was willing to look for him. Su Sanlang stuffed all the copper coins into Wu's arms. Old Wu noticed that there was still a little dried blood on the copper coins. He glanced at Su Sanlang and said, although I'm not good at tending to women, I'll go take a look since you're so anxious. Old Wu turned to get the medical kit and followed Su Sanlang out. Su Sanlang walked quickly, which showed how anxious he was. Old Wu could not help but give Su Sanlang a second look. He was a dark-skinned man in his 30s, with many patches on his clothes and a hole in his shoe. His back was a little hunched, and he couldn't tell that he loved his wife so much. When he followed Su Sanlang to the Su residence, they ran into Madame Wang, who was beating up Su Sanmei. I'll beat you to death, you little shit, thief, how dare you steal from my family. Bah, Madame Wang's curses were filled with malice. Su Sanmei jumped in pain and begged for mercy. Grandma, I was wrong, don't hit me, mother. Su Sanlang's heart ached. When Madame Wang hit Su Sanmei, it was not a light punishment. Instead, she swung a stick with strong force. She grabbed Su Sanmei by the hair as she kept struggling and running. Madame Wang cursed as she hit her. Madame Wang let go at the sounds of Su Sanlang's voice. Su Sanmei immediately ran over to Su Sanlang's side. Her face was covered in tears, but she did not dare to say anything bad about Madame Wang. Su Sanlang's heart ached, but he could only put Su Sanmei aside for the time being. He said to Old Wu, Dr. Wu, come with me. Old Wu nodded and followed Su Sanlang to the back room. He pushed the door open. It was pitch dark inside and smelled strongly of blood. Old Wu bent down to enter. Su Sanlang held Su Sanmei's hand and followed worriedly. Madame Zhao was lying unconscious on the bed. Old Wu took her pulse and said, it's weakness caused by excessive bleeding. I'll stop her bleeding first, but she would still have to take some medicine. Her body is too weak. If she wants to live, she cannot give birth again in the future. If she does, she'll die. Madame Zhao's pulse was really weak, as if she was hanging on by a thread. It was a miracle that she could hold on until he arrived. However, after this, she would definitely not be able to give birth in the future. When Su Sanlang heard this, he did not care much about Madame Zhao not being able to give birth again. Instead, he sighed with relief and said, as long as my mother is safe, if she couldn't have more children, then so be it. She'd already given birth to 4 children for him, and it wasn't as if they didn't have sons. He had no right to blame her. This was his fate. When Old Wu heard his sigh, he said as he administered acupuncture to Madame Zhao, your children's mother can be saved this time. If it had been any later, even an immortal wouldn't have been able to save her. Come back with me later and get some medicine to boil for her to drink. Her body is very weak, and she needs to rest in bed for the next 2 months. Madame Zhao's body was very weak. She was pregnant, but she was extremely thin. When he took her pulse, he knew that she often starved. There was no color on her face, and her health was not good. This family was not simple. He did not know if it was good or bad for her to survive. When Su Sanlang heard this, he clenched his fists and replied, thank you, Dr. Wu, I understand. Your youngest daughter is awake. When Old Wu was putting away his needles, he found that Su Xiaolu had woken up. The newborn baby was very cute. When she woke up, she did not cry or make a fuss. Her eyes seemed to be looking at him. She was so obedient that Old Wu could not help but smile. She was a good child. Su Sanlang looked over, and Su Xiaolu's eyes immediately turned to him. Although her vision was a little blurry, Su Xiaolu still recognized him. This man was her father. She had been awake for a while and had heard the conversation between her father and the doctor. She had a preliminary impression of the couple. His family was in a difficult situation. But his parents were good parents. Sime, be good, don't cry, father will give you sugar syrup later. Su Xiaolu's obedience almost softened Su Sanlang's heart. For some reason, he felt that his newborn daughter could understand him. She hadn't eaten for hours after she was born, but she didn't cry. She looked at him, yawned, and obediently closed her eyes again to sleep. Su Xiaolu fell asleep again, mainly because she felt hungry, but there was definitely nothing to eat at this time. She decided that she should sleep, as she would not be hungry in her sleep. However, she did not really sleep. Instead, she let her consciousness enter the space to receive the baptism of spiritual energy. She had accepted the fact that she had been reborn as a fetus. Besides, she still had the space. It wasn't very useful now, but she would grow up. When she could walk and run, it would be very useful. When she entered the space, it was like her soul had come here, while her body was sleeping outside the space. She didn't have to worry about being found out, and she could clean up the space's land while she slept. It felt good. How obedient. In my 60 years of living, I've never seen such an obedient child. Old Wu thought that if someone spoke, the baby would start crying. Unexpectedly, she didn't. He couldn't help but take a few more glances. Su Sanmei said softly, "Dad." Sime couldn't stop crying just now. Su Sanlang was suddenly nervous. "Dr. Wu, take a look at my daughter. Is there something wrong?" Thinking of his two foolish sons, Su Sanlang's heart tightened, afraid that there was something wrong with his fourth daughter. Old Wu packed up the silver needles and smiled. "Your daughter is very healthy. Her complexion is rosy and her eyes are bright. She can't be any healthier." Su Sanlang relaxed. He was glad that the baby was okay. Old Wu put away the medicine box and said to Su Sanlang, "All right, the bleeding has stopped. Just take the medicine and rest well later." Su Sanlang heaved a sigh of relief and was about to follow Old Wu back to get the medicine when he heard the sound of old Master Su returning home. Then, he heard Madame Wang wailing and complaining, "Old man, you have to help me. Sanlang, this unfilial son, has rebelled." Su Sanlang frowned. His eyes filled with indescribable pain. Old Wu sighed softly and said, "If you're not free, let your daughter go with me to get the medicine." Su Sanlang looked at Old Wu gratefully, then said to Su Sanmei, "Sanmei, go back with Dr. Wu to get medicine for your mother." Su Sanmei nodded obediently and followed Old Wu out. Su Sanlang closed the door softly and headed for the outer room. He knew that there would be a disaster waiting for him. He understood what it was, but deep down, he couldn't help but hope for a miracle. He was his parents' biological son. They wouldn't force his family to die. Su Sanlang reached the door, and paused before entering. He knelt down in front of old Master Su and explained, "Father, I didn't deliberately resist Mother. Hua and Chang's mother was in danger. She was bleeding and her life was at risk, so I had no choice but to do that. Madame Zhao gave birth to 4 children for me. I couldn't leave her in the lurch. You unfilial son, I raised you up in vain. If I had known you were so unfilial, I would have pressed you into a urine bucket and drowned you back then. You're black-hearted to treat me like this for an outsider. If I let you disobey me today, you will dare to sh*t on my head tomorrow. Since you don't have me in your heart, I don't want you as a son. Bring your family of useless trash and get lost." Madame Wang pointed at Su Sanlang and cursed him fiercely. She did not look frightened as she did not earlier. She was alone at home just now, and she could not suppress Su Sanlang when he was angry. Now, it was different. The head of the family was here. Even if Su Sanlang was given 100 guts, he would not dare to challenge his biological father. "Third brother, you're really muddle-headed. You can still find another wife, but you only have one mother." Madame Li added fuel to the fire from the side. It seemed she had completely forgotten that she was also a daughter-in-law who had married into the family. Old Master Su's expression darkened as he asked, "What did the doctor say?" Su Sanlang's jaw clenched and his cheeks puffed. He said with difficulty, "Dr. Wu said that she has bad health and can't give birth again in the future. She will definitely die if she gives birth again. Madame Zhao has done me justice by giving birth to 4 children. It's my bad luck. In the future, I won't let Madame Zhao give birth again." With that, Su Sanlang looked up at old Master Su with determination. He wanted to see some warmth in old Master Su's eyes, but he was disappointed. There was only endless coldness in old Master Su's eyes. At this moment, Su Sanlang understood that his father was going to give up on him. Before old Master Su could speak, Madame Wang said coldly, "Madame Zhao is a jinx. You have to divorce her. That little loser is also a jinx. She's a jinx the moment she was born. It's better to get rid of her as soon as possible. If you don't agree, your entire family will have to get lost." Old Master Su took a few deep breaths before saying to Su Sanlang, "Sanlang, you made a huge mistake today. Father and mother can't stand you. Did you hear what your mother said? If you do as she says, you'll still be my third son. If you're unwilling, then you can bring your family and get out. If Madame Zhao could not give birth, she would be useless. The third branch had 4 children, but none of them could support them. They were equivalent to seedlings that did not grow well in the fields. They had to be removed as soon as possible so that they would not affect the seedlings that grew well. After abandoning the third branch, he still had 2 sons. The eldest son had 3 sons, and the second son had 2 sons. Each of these 2 families were going to send a son to school. The burden of the third branch had to be abandoned. Old Master Su seemed to have given Su Sanlang the choice, but in reality, he did not leave any leeway at all. He knew that Su Sanlang would not divorce Madame Zhao or abandon the newborn girls. Su Sanlang's heart ached. He gritted his teeth so hard as if he wanted to break them. He didn't come back to his senses until he tasted blood in his mouth. He looked at old Master Su and said, "All right, then father and mother shall separate us from the family. We will live on our own." After saying that, Su Sanlang lowered his head and bent down to kowtow to old Master Su and Madame Wang. He only hoped that this would make his parents feel more sympathetic and give him more things. Madame Wang turned around and mocked coldly, "Don't kowtow anymore. I can't take it." Old Master Su said calmly, "I'll give you 200 caddies, 1 of golden jade rod, 50 caddies of rice, 10 caddies of cured meat, and 2 chickens. Bring your family to live in that old house at the back of the mountain. I'll give you the 4 acres of land at the back of the mountain. As for the vegetables, I'll give you 30 caddies." With that, old Master Su stopped talking. Su Sanlang waited for a while before confirming that this was all his parents had given him. He looked at old Master Su in disbelief and said with difficulty, "What about the fields?" His family had 10 acres of good land and 10 acres of good fields, but his father did not want to give him any. There were 20 chickens in the house, 5 ducks, and 8 or 9 pieces of cured meat. Each piece weighed more than 10 caddies. The golden jade rod had a good harvest this year and could collect more than 3,000 caddies. The harvest of rice was also good, amounting to more than 1,000 caddies. However, they had only given to him 2 chickens, 10 caddies of meat, 50 caddies of rice, 200 caddies of golden jade rod, and 30 caddies of green vegetable leaves. Su Sanlang felt extremely pained. His parents' hearts were so biased. Old Master Su said coldly, "You don't have a successor. Your eldest brother and second brother have a lot of family members. Moreover, Ching and Shun are going to study. If they can produce results, our family will have to sell our fields to send them for exams. You've been unfilial and disobedient today. It's already very kind of me to share these with you. If you still want to cause trouble, I can only ask the village chief to remove you from the family register and treat it as if I don't have a son like you in the future." By saying that, old Master Su was clear that he was giving up on Su Sanlang. The 6 of them would definitely not be able to survive this winter until next year's harvest with these supplies. But even so, old Master Su was determined to do so. Since old Master Su had already said so, it would be even more disadvantageous for Su Sanlang if he were to say anything else. His eyes filled with tears, and he had to grit his teeth to force the word "okay" out. Seeing Su Sanlang agree, old Master Su's gloomy expression softened a little. "I'll give you 2 more pots and pans. In the future, when your family is living outside, it doesn't matter to us whether you are well. You don't have to be filial to us either." Su Sanlang's heart was bleeding, but he had to endure the pain and replied with gratitude, "Thank you, father." Su Sanlang got up and was about to return to the back room in a daze. When Madame Li saw this, she could not help but smile. She gently nudged Su Dalong and said, "Dalong, third brother's family is going out to live. Help him move his things." Su Dalong came back to his senses and realized that this situation was advantageous to him. He smiled and agreed. "All right." Su Erlang also replied, "As we should." Su Erlang did not feel much sadness. He had also gained from this situation. They had all grown up and had their own families. Although they had not separated, their families were still different. Third brother's family was a burden. There was something wrong with Hua and Chong's brains. They might cause trouble one day. San Mei and Si Mei were both girls. When they grew up, they would belong to someone else. Staying at home was useless. His son had to go to school, and that would cost money. Removing this family's burden was a good thing, no matter what. In the name of brotherhood, Su Dalong and Su Erlang moved the things that old Master Su had given to Su Sanlang to the old house. However, when no one was paying attention, Madame Li quietly slipped into the back room.